All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another wonderful week of virtual learning here at Bethune Elementary School. This is Mrs. Patterson and Miss Felix coming at you live from our houses where we are safe and sound. This week, let me make sure we go in order. We are going to kick it off with our pledge of success, just to make sure that we wrap our minds around what we are focused on today so that we can get through this lesson. I know there are probably several distractions that you have at home, whether it is your sibling, your parents, or the TV or Fortnite or any of those other things that I don't understand why you like it, but you do. So let's go ahead and get our minds wrapped around today with our pledge of success. So I will be the rose that grew from the concrete, able to stand on my own feet. I am proud of who I am and confident in who I will be. If I'm focused, I will achieve anything that I can dream. Look out, world, because once I have started, there is nothing stopping me. All right, now that we are ready for success, let's go ahead and get started. This is week 5 if you are on target, and today is Monday, day 1 of week 5. All this week, we're going to be working on the following standard. It is ELA, GSE, 4, RL6. Those are just a bunch of numbers and letters to you all. What you are working on is being able to compare and contrast the point of view from which different stories are narrated, including the difference between first and third person narrations. So by the end of this week, you will be able to proudly say, I can compare and contrast different points of views. So that is our goal for this week, and we're going to do that by reading this story. You see this little cartoon down here at the bottom, so we're going to get to that. But first, let's wrap our minds around what we're doing. So in this lesson this week, we're going to be reading different stories about different students' experiences, and we're going to be comparing and contrasting the narrators' points of view across those stories. So already, just from looking at the screen, this is what you would see if you are using your Nearpod, or maybe you have a printed out packet, and this is what you guys are seeing. So if that is the case, you would look and you would see at the very top, Lesson 18, Comparing Points of View. Already we see a lot of big things, bold words jumping out at us. We see the words narrator, we see the word point of view, first person and third person. So these are going to be our academic talk words of the week. We want to make sure that we add this vocabulary to our memory banks. We want to make sure that by the end of this week we know exactly what a narrator is. We know what a point of view is, and we can compare and contrast the difference between first-person narrators as well as third-person narrators. So join me if you have your packet or if you're on your Nearpod, and let's go ahead and start reading. Our learning target is to be able to compare narrators and their thoughts and feelings about what happens, and that will help us to develop a deeper understanding of story characters and events. So as we read along, it says, in stories, the narrator is the person who tells the story. The narrator always has a point of view, or how he or she thinks or feels about the story. Some narrators are characters in the story. That means that they experience what happens and are called first-person narrators, while there are other narrators who are not characters in the stories. These narrators look in from the outside of the story, and they are called third-person narrators. So that's a lot of information to take in at once. So I want to give you guys an example. Right now, as I'm recording this video, I am sitting outside on my porch while the rest of my family is inside watching TV and chilling out. So already I'm telling you about a story that I am experiencing. I'm a character in this story, so I use some key words, some key pronouns like I, in my, in mine. Think back to when we talked about point of view while we all were together in school. Whenever we use first-person narrators, we use those pronouns that include the narrator in the story, like I, my, and mine. Then we have the flip side, where the narrator is not in the story, but they're telling you about the story. So I'm going to tell you about someone that is not me and what they're doing. So right now, Serenity is inside, so I'm using her name. She is currently watching Trolls World Tour, and she is going to be eating lunch pretty shortly. So I'm not in the story, so my pronouns shifted. Now I'm telling you a character's name, Serenity, and I'm using pronouns like she, he, they. So we're going to see that big difference as we continue to read today. And let's go back to our story. It says, when you read, pay attention not just to what narrators say, but also to how they say it. Their points of view will affect the way that we interpret what happens in a story. So we're going to be reading through, looking for those key pronouns as we go through this. And I want you to remember that you can tell the same story in two different ways. Let's imagine if we had two different narrators. It could be myself and Serenity. We would be telling the same story about what we're doing, but we would use different pronouns because our narrators have different points of view. I would use words like I, me, and mine, but if I'm telling the story about Serenity, I would say she, her, or they, or I would use her name as a character. So our goal is to be able to identify the different narrators and what point of view is being used. I want you to remember that when you read a story, ask yourself first, who is the narrator? Because the narrator is going to affect how the story is told and what details are included in that story. You're going to get a better idea as we continue below with this cartoon. So if you're on the Nearpod or if you're in your packet, please direct your attention to the cartoon below. The very first one on the left side says, as I walked down the hall, my friends stared at me, but I wasn't surprised at all. I wanted everybody's attention. So we see some key words already, some key pronouns sticking out. It says, as I walked down the hall, my friends stared at me, but I wasn't surprised at all. I wanted everybody's attention. So our big pronouns right here are I, my, and me. So we know that our narrator, the little girl whose thought bubbles we're seeing, is also a character in our story. So that would make this one on the left side a first-person narration. If we look over at the right side of the cartoon, it says, as Martha walked down the hall, her friends stared at her. She wasn't at all surprised. After all, she wanted their attention. So the key words that should be sticking out to you, or those key pronouns, are the fact that we used a character's name. We said Martha instead of I walked down the hall. We then said her friends stared at her, and she wasn't surprised at all. So those are our key pronouns for this cartoon. If you are using the Nearpod, I want you to go ahead and click over to the next slide where you are going to see a Venn diagram pop up on the screen. If you are using a packet, go ahead and flip over to the next page, and we should all now be looking at the same Venn diagram. If you remember from school, a Venn diagram, which are these two circles that are overlapping one another, is a graphic organizer or a tool that we can use to compare and contrast. If you look up here, we see in bold letters, we see the words compare and we see the word contrast. These two words have different meanings. When you are comparing something, you are telling how those two are similar or how they are alike. On a Venn diagram, you put all of those things that are similar or alike in the middle part of the Venn diagram, like how we see here it says the word alike. On the outside, we are contrasting, or we are telling how those two things are different from one another. So on this specific Venn diagram, it wants us to compare and contrast the differences and similarities between first-person narrators and third-person narrators. And we are going to use our cartoon from today in order to do this. So a big difference between first-person and third-person narrators are the pronouns that we use. So if I were here on my Nearpod and I wanted to fill this out, I would come down below and grab my text box. I want my color to be blue because that's my favorite color, and I'm going to assume you guys are typing in your favorite colors too. So here for first person, I'm going to think about the different pronouns that we use. So I know in the story with the little girl, it says, as I walked down the hall, my friend stared at me, but I wasn't at all surprised. I wanted everybody's attention. So I saw the pronouns I saw me, and I saw my. So those pronouns are different from the pronouns that we use for third person. So I'm going to go over to the other side since I know that we are contrasting the differences between the two. And so in a third person narration, we use things such as characters' names, or we talk about people who are not there with us. So I would say they did that, or he did that, or she did that. In this specific cartoon, it says, as Martha, so I have a character's name, as Martha walked down the hall, her friend stared at her. She wasn't at all surprised. After all, she wanted their attention. So I now have different pronouns on both sides of my Venn diagram because we are contrasting the differences. Another difference that we will see between first-person narration and third-person narration is who the narrator is. So in our very first story, I would say that our main character is telling her own story. So she is telling her own story. That's a big key detail that we need to remember with the differences between first person and third person narration. I would then go to the other side of my Venn diagram and I would do the opposite, because if it's not first person, it's the opposite, which is our third person. So I would type here in my Venn diagram that they are telling someone else's story. So they're telling someone else's story. I'm going to leave that middle part where they are alike for you all to fill out, because I've already given you the differences. I helped you out a lot with that. But I want you to type in your text box, how are these two different points of view or these two narrations the same? What do they have in common with one another? So that's going to be for you to fill out. That's going to be the rest of your task for today. We will come back tomorrow and we will follow it up with some scientific text, and we will go through a much longer story. Today is just to wrap your mind around the differences between first person and third person. But I hope that you notice we are missing one of our points of views on this Venn diagram here. We talked about first, we talked about third, but if we were counting in order, we would go first, second, and third. So you might be asking yourself, okay, Mrs. Patterson and Ms. Felix, we're talking about first and third. Is there such thing as a second person narration? There is. We don't use second person a lot because second person is usually found when we are giving directions to a recipe. That is because second person point of view uses pronouns such as you and your. The narrator is talking directly to the person that is reading the story. So for example, I could be giving directions on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. If I was the narrator and I was in the story, I would use first person pronouns. So I would say, I grab the bread, then I get out the peanut butter, I stir it with the jelly so that it is to my liking because I'm in the story. It could also be third person, where I could be telling you about someone else making a peanut butter sandwich. Let's say Serenity gets hungry at lunch and she wants her peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I would say Serenity grabbed her piece of bread and she then grabbed the peanut butter and jelly out of the cabinet. So I'm giving directions about someone else because I am not in that story. I am not doing those actions. That would be third person. Second person is different. Second person would be if I was giving directions as the narrator directly to the reader or directly to you, my listener. I could say if you get hungry, you could go grab your peanut butter and jelly and grab your bread to make your sandwich. So there is a such thing as second person. We don't see it a lot when we come to reading, but our focus this week is going to be on comparing and contrasting the differences between first person and third person. Yes, there is a second person that uses you and your, but we won't see that a lot this week. So I would like for you all to take the time to finish up this Venn diagram. Go ahead and insert your text box to tell how first person and third person narration are alike or how they are similar, because we are comparing them. We already contrasted. We already said the differences. You're going to finish out by telling us how they are the same. You'll see below there's also a place for you to talk about these different ideas, either with your partner, whether that's a friend at home or that is your parent or guardian. But go ahead and talk about the talk section where it says, did you and your partner identify the same similarities and differences? And what details from the cartoon did you use to help compare and contrast the two? I will see you all again tomorrow on day 2 of week 5.